The brass candlestick cracked against my skull. Jackson Reed wasn't here to kill me. He was here to save me. My fingers closed around the flash drive in his pocket as blood dripped into my eyes. $3 million wasn't just stolen. It was weaponized. And the merger we celebrated tonight, it was already dead. The drive burned in my palm. My wife's laughter still echoed from the dining room. I had 30 seconds before the doors opened again. This time, it wouldn't be a whistleblower. The fluorescent lights of the private dining room hummed, a persistent vibration against David Miller's temples. He reached for his water glass, but his fingers hesitated, hovering just an inch above the condensation. The silver mark on his collar, the date 22 written in precise metallic ink, felt like a brand against his skin. It was 8:14 p.m. Everything in his world was designed to be symmetrical, load-bearing, and predictable. Yet, as he looked across the table at the heavy velvet curtains of the Chicago skyline, the city felt like a jagged iron cage pressing in on him. David adjusted his cufflink, a small rectangular piece of polished onyx. To the 15 influential guests surrounding him, he was the picture of architectural triumph, the man who was finally rebuilding the Miller legacy. But beneath the table, his thumbs swiped rhythmically across the face of his smartwatch. A red notification pulsed like a dying star. $3 million had vanished from his private offshore account since dawn. The money hadn't just moved. It had been surgically extracted, leaving a vacuum where his firm's stability used to be. Every toast, every clink of crystal, sounded to David like the groan of a skyscraper's joints just before a total collapse. "To the Miller Tower," Marcus Taylor boomed, standing at the head of the table. Marcus, David's partner of 20 years, checked his $50,000 watch and tapped the glass with a heavy gold ring. "To the man who proves that gravity is just a suggestion when you have the right blueprints." David forced a smile, though his jaw felt like it was carved from cold marble. Beside him, his wife Sarah leaned in, her perfume a cloying scent of lilies, thick enough to stick to the back of his throat. She touched his forearm, her grip light but firm. Her emerald eyes searched his, but they didn't reach the warmth of her practiced smile. David felt the vibration of his phone in his pocket again. Another alert. The Empire wasn't just bleeding, it was hemorrhaging. He was hunting a thief in a room full of friends, and the air felt dangerously thin. The heavy oak doors of the private suite didn't just open. They slammed against the wall with a violence that made the crystal chandelier overhead dance. The rhythmic clatter of the dining room died instantly, replaced by the low, mechanical roar of the industrial fans from the hallway. Jackson Reed stood in the threshold. He looked like a ghost haunting his own life. Wiry, disheveled, with a nervous energy that seemed to vibrate the very air around him. The faded scar through his left eyebrow was a jagged white line against his flushed skin. He didn't look at the guests. His eyes were fixed on David with a terrifying, singular focus. "You think you've built something that lasts?" Jackson's voice was ragged, a sharp contrast to the soft jazz playing in the background. He stepped into the room, his boots tracking slush onto the pristine carpet. David stood, his chair screeching against the floor like a wounded animal. "Jackson, you're not supposed to be here. Security escorted you out months ago." "Security?" Jackson laughed, a dry, hacking sound. He lunged toward the table, his hand closing around a heavy brass candlestick. The metal caught the light, a golden blur as he swung it with desperate, uncoordinated strength. David ducked, the wind of the heavy object whistling past his ear. The scent of metallic sweat and old rain rolled off Jackson. The guests screamed, a chaotic chorus that David barely heard over the pounding of his own heart. He moved with the precision of a man who understood angles and force. As Jackson swung again, David stepped into the man's personal space, his shoulder hitting Jackson's chest. They tumbled to the floor, a tangle of expensive wool and frayed denim. The floorboards groaned under their combined weight. David pinned Jackson's wrists to the carpet, the rough fibers scraping against his knuckles. Jackson was muttering, a low, frantic string of words about load-bearing lies and the system closing in. In the struggle, David felt something hard and rectangular pressed against Jackson's thigh. With a quick, practiced motion, he slipped his hand into Jackson's pocket and snatched a small black flash drive. "Get him out of here," Marcus shouted, his voice booming over the chaos. Two men in dark suits, security David didn't recognize, grabbed Jackson by the armpits and dragged him toward the exit. Jackson didn't fight them. He just stared at David, his hand moving instinctively to touch the scar on his eyebrow. "Check the logs, David," Jackson screamed as the doors swung shut. "Check the foundation before it buries you." Silence returned to the room, but it was a heavy, artificial thing. David stood, brushing the dust from his blazer, his mind racing. He felt the weight of the drive in his palm, cold and jagged. He needed to be alone. He needed to see what Jackson had brought to his door. David excused himself, his voice a calm, structural audit that betrayed nothing of the storm inside. He slipped away from the concerned whispers of Sarah and the predatory gaze of Marcus, navigating the hallway toward a small, private alcove near the wine cellar. The air here was cooler, smelling of damp earth and expensive cork. He pulled out a slim laptop he kept in his briefcase and slotted the drive into the port. The plastic casing of the drive was scratched, as if it had been carried through a war zone. Subverted. As the files populated the screen, David's breathing slowed. He expected to see Jackson's manifesto, the rambling grievances of a disgruntled employee. After all, Jackson had been fired for instability and erratic behavior. It made perfect sense that the man would try to extort or embarrass the firm. David's finger hovered over the trackpad, ready to find evidence of Jackson's theft to hand over to the police. This was the logical conclusion. Jackson was the villain of the piece. The first file opened. It wasn't a ransom note. It was a series of wire transfer receipts. David felt a wave of relief. Here it is, he thought. The proof that Jackson stole the $3 million. He began to scroll, his eyes scanning the routing numbers with the speed of a man used to checking blueprints for errors. He would call the authorities, clear his name, and the nightmare would end. He could almost feel the tension leaving his shoulders. He would be the hero who caught the thief. But as he reached the bottom of the ledger, his relief curdled into a cold, sickening dread. The money hadn't been transferred to Jackson's account. The $3 million had been used to purchase a controlling interest in Apex Structural, a direct rival firm that had been undercutting David's bids for months. David's brow furrowed. He opened the second file, a series of internal memos from the rival firm. His heart hammered against his ribs. The memos weren't addressed to Jackson. They were addressed to a silent partner who provided the Miller Tower's proprietary load-bearing calculations. The truth hit him like a physical blow to the solar plexus. Jackson hadn't stolen the data. He had stolen it back. The drive contained a mirror of the firm's secret ledger, the one David didn't know existed. Jackson wasn't the one tearing the building down. He was the one who had tried to brace the walls. The attack in the dining room hadn't been an attempt on David's life. It had been a desperate, violent delivery system for the only truth that could save him. Jackson had played the villain to bypass the guards who were already watching David. David leaned back against the cold stone wall of the cellar. The realization was a catastrophic reveal. The people he was currently protecting upstairs were the ones who had already sold him out. He hadn't just lost $3 million. He had lost his entire defensive perimeter. He was sitting at a table with the architects of his own execution. The quiet of the wine cellar was shattered by a sharp, rhythmic chirping from David's pocket. It was his phone, but the tone was different. An emergency override he'd set up years ago for the firm's central server. He pulled the device out, the screen's white light blinding in the dim cellar. Alert. Remote access detected. Data purge initiated. 0.2% complete. David's blood turned to ice. Someone was wiping the firm's servers from a remote location. Every blueprint, every legal contract, and most importantly, every digital footprint of the $3 million theft was being dissolved into digital ash. He had less than 10 minutes before his entire professional existence was erased. He scrambled to his feet, his mind working in overdrive. He needed to call his IT director, a man he'd trusted for a decade. He dialed the number, pressing the phone to his ear. Silence. Not even a busy signal. The line was dead, as if the entire network had been severed. He moved toward the door, intending to head back to the ballroom to find Sarah. But he stopped. He looked down at his hands and realized he was shaking. He forced himself to perform a mental audit. Focus on the physical. Focus on the variables. He remembered Sarah's hand on his arm earlier. He closed his eyes, visualizing the moment. She had been leaning in, her emerald eyes bright, her jewelry clinking softly. But there was a detail he'd missed in his perfectionist haze. Her left hand. She always wore the 5-carat diamond wedding ring he'd bought her after the first Miller Tower contract. Always. But tonight, as she touched his sleeve, her finger had been bare. There was only a faint, pale indentation in her skin where the gold should have been. A cold draft swept through the hallway, carrying the scent of ozone and floor wax. David walked toward the main exit of the restaurant, his pace quickening. He reached for the heavy brass handles of the double doors that led to the street. He pulled. The doors didn't budge. There was a dull, heavy clank, the sound of metal on metal. He looked through the narrow glass pane. A thick industrial chain had been looped through the handles on the outside, secured with a heavy padlock. The restaurant, a place of supposed luxury and safety, had been turned into a pressurized chamber. He was locked in with his betrayers. David turned away from the door, his breath coming in ragged hitches. He needed to get to the kitchen, to the service exits. Maybe they hadn't been compromised yet. He began to move through the back hallways, the staff-only corridors where the velvet gave way to cold linoleum and exposed pipes. As he rounded the corner toward the kitchen prep area, 2 men stepped out from the shadows of a linen closet. They were wearing the same dark suits as the security who had taken Jackson away. One of them, a man with a neck wider than his head, was clicking a heavy metal pen. Open, shut, open, shut. "Mr. Miller," the man said. His voice was a flat, military monotone. "Mr. Taylor is concerned about your health. He thinks you should come back to the table." David stepped back, his heel catching on a stray floor mat. "I was just looking for the restroom." The second man didn't speak. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folding knife. The blade flicked open with a sound like a dry bone snapping. The light from the overhead fluorescent flickered, reflecting off the steel. "We can do this in the hall," the man with the pen said, his voice dropping an octave. He began to crack his knuckles in a slow, rhythmic sequence. 1, 2, 3, 4. David recognized the countdown. It was the sound of a man preparing for violence. David didn't wait for 5. He lunged to his right, grabbing a heavy, circular metal serving tray from a stack against the wall. As the man with the knife lunged, David swung the tray like a shield. The blade shrieked against the stainless steel, sending a spark dancing into the air. The impact vibrated up David's arm, a numbing jolt that nearly made him drop the tray. He didn't think. He reacted. He shoved the edge of the tray into the throat of the man with the knife, a desperate, unrefined move. The man let out a choked gasp and stumbled back. David didn't stay to see if he'd finished the job. He turned and sprinted toward the swinging double doors of the kitchen. He burst through them, the roar of the industrial dishwashers and the hiss of steam hitting him like a physical wall of sound. The kitchen was a labyrinth of stainless steel and white tile. The air was thick with the smell of scorched garlic and industrial soap. David scrambled past a massive butcher block, his shoes slipping on the wet floor. Behind him, he heard the heavy thud of the kitchen doors swinging open again. The guards were coming. He ducked behind a line of towering refrigerators, his chest heaving. He needed to see that drive again. There had to be more. He pulled out his phone and connected it to the flash drive using a small adapter he kept for emergencies. His fingers were slick with sweat, making the screen smudge. He found a hidden directory, password protected. He tried his birthday. No. Sarah's birthday. No. He tried the date of his father's greatest failure. The day the first Miller building had collapsed. The file opened. It was a video. The image was grainy, taken from a high-angle security camera in a wine cellar, this wine cellar. The timestamp was from 10 minutes before the dinner had started. David watched the screen, his stomach twisting into a knot. There was Sarah, her jewelry sparkling even in the dim light. She was standing close to Marcus, too close. Marcus was holding a tablet, showing her something. The server wipe starts at 8:30. Marcus's voice came through the tiny speaker, muffled but unmistakable. By the time the police look at the accounts, the only name on the offshore transfers will be David's. We have the logs set up to show he was the one who authorized the Apex buyout. Sarah nodded, her face a mask of cold calculation. And the suicide note, already drafted, Marcus said, tapping his watch. The guards will handle the rest in the coat room. It'll look like he couldn't live with the guilt of the embezzlement. Sarah reached out and straightened Marcus's tie, a gesture of intimacy that felt like a knife in David's ribs. Make sure it's clean, Marcus. I don't want any loose threads. David closed the file, the screen going black. The woman he had shared a bed with for 15 years and the man he had called his brother were not just stealing his company. They were planning his funeral. The sound of the dishwasher died down, and in the sudden silence, David heard the rhythmic pop, pop, pop of knuckles cracking. The guards were in the kitchen. David. Marcus's voice called out, echoing off the tile walls. Don't make this difficult. We just want to talk about the legacy. David looked around the kitchen. He was trapped. The service exit was likely chained just like the front. But then his eyes landed on the manager's office, a small glass-walled cube perched on a raised platform overlooking the prep area. It had a dedicated landline and, more importantly, a direct Ethernet port. If he could get there, he could bypass the restaurant's spotty Wi-Fi. He could upload the video and the ledgers to a secure cloud server before the wipe was complete. He looked at his watch. 0.8% complete. He had to move. David stayed low, crawling behind the industrial ovens. The heat was stifling, the smell of roasted meat and gas filling his lungs. He could see the shadows of the guards moving near the walk-in freezer, their flashlights cutting through the steam. He reached the base of the stairs leading to the office. He took a breath, feeling the cold metal of the railing. He began to climb, but as he moved, a voice stopped him cold. 1, 2, 3. It was Marcus. He was counting the stairs as he approached from the other side of the kitchen. The robotic, eerie habit signaled his psychological rigidity. He was close. David lunged for the office door, slipping inside and locking it just as the beam of a flashlight swept across the glass. He dove under the desk, fumbling for the Ethernet cable. He found it, a thick, gray cord dangling near the floor. He jammed it into his laptop with a click that sounded like a gunshot in the small room. The screen flickered. Connection established. He initiated the upload. The progress bar appeared, crawling with agonizing slowness. Upload. 0.1%, 0.2%. A heavy fist slammed against the office door. The glass rattled in its frame. "Open the door, David," Marcus said, his voice calm, almost fatherly. "You're an architect. You know when a structure is no longer viable. This firm is coming down. Don't be inside when it happens." David ignored him, his eyes glued to the screen. He began typing, his fingers flying across the keys. He wasn't just uploading, he was fighting back. He accessed the building's internal schematic, the one he'd helped draft as a consultant for the restaurant's renovation. He found the backdoor codes, the digital keys he'd insisted on keeping for every project he touched. He entered a sequence that bypassed the restaurant's firewall, diverting all the available bandwidth to his upload. The progress bar jumped. 45%. 60%. A loud crack echoed through the room. A spiderweb of fractures appeared in the glass door. The guards were using a fire extinguisher to smash their way in. "Almost there," David whispered, his knuckles gray as he gripped the edge of the desk. 85%. 90%. The glass shattered. A rain of crystalline shards fell onto the carpet, sounding like breaking ice. Marcus stepped through the frame, a suppressed pistol in his hand. The black silencer made the weapon look unnaturally long, like a predatory finger pointing at David's heart. "Step away from the computer, David," Marcus said. He wasn't counting now. His face was a mask of cold, calculated fury. David stood up slowly, his hands raised. Behind him, the laptop screen flashed a brilliant, steady green. "Upload complete. Cloud sync successful." "It's over, Marcus," David said, his voice steady for the first time that night. "The logs, the video from the cellar, the wire transfers, they're all in the cloud. My lawyer, the DA, the press, they'll all have it in an hour." Marcus didn't flinch. He just looked at the screen and then back at David. A slow, thin smile spread across his face. "You always were too focused on the blueprints, David. You never looked at the foundation of the people around you." Marcus stepped aside, and Sarah walked into the room. She was holding a small, elegant evening bag, but her hand was inside it, the fabric pulled tight over the shape of a second pistol. "David, honey," she said, her voice dripping with a false, honeyed warmth. "You really should have checked the accounts one last time before you started your little broadcast." Subverted, David felt a flicker of confusion. "I did check them, Sarah. I saw the $3 million. I saw the buyout of Apex." "Oh, that?" Sarah laughed, a sharp, melodic sound that chilled David to the bone. "That was just the bait. We knew Jackson would find that. We wanted him to. We wanted him to bring you that drive." She stepped closer, the smell of lilies now overwhelming, suffocating. She pulled a tablet from her bag and turned the screen toward him. "While you were busy playing hero in the kitchen, I finished the final transfer," she said. David looked at the screen. His heart stopped, There was a new account, opened only 20 minutes ago. It was a non-traceable Caribbean entity, but it wasn't in Sarah's name. It wasn't in Marcus's name. The account holder was listed as David Miller, and the balance wasn't $3 million. It was $50 million, the entire liquid reserve of the Miller Tower project, the money meant for the steel, the labor, the very bones of his legacy. I used your private biometric key while you were struggling with Jackson, Sarah whispered. Leaning in so close, her breath tickled his ear. I took your thumbprint while you were pinned on the floor. To the world, it looks like you stole the $3 million to buy Apex. And then, when you realized the feds were closing in, you tried to drain the company and flee. The truth hit David like a collapsing ceiling. His smart move, using the flash drive, broadcasting the data, had played right into their hands. By broadcasting the theft logs, he had just provided the public evidence of his own crime. He had effectively announced his own guilt to the world. The video in the cellar? David stammered, his mind reeling. The one where you talked about the suicide note? Deep fake, David, Marcus said, tapping his temple. We knew you'd look at the security footage. We fed you exactly what you wanted to see, a classic villain monologue to make you feel like the righteous victim. It kept you busy while the real money moved. David felt his knees go weak. He was in a worse position than when the night started. He hadn't just lost his company. He had handed his enemies the rope they were going to use to hang him. He was trapped in a structural failure of his own making. Now, Marcus said, raising the pistol, let's talk about that suicide note. It's a shame, really. A perfectionist who couldn't handle the weight of his own flaws. The air in the small office felt heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and the metallic tang of the pistol's silencer. David looked at the shattered glass on the floor, the shards reflecting the blinking green light of the laptop. He was an architect. He knew that when a structure was failing, you didn't try to patch the walls. You triggered the demolition. You're right, Marcus, David said, his voice dropping to a low, resonant tone. I do focus on the details, like the fact that this restaurant was built in 1924. But the fire suppression system was updated last year to my specifications. Marcus frowned, his finger tightening on the trigger. What are you talking about? David didn't answer with words. He reached under the desk, his fingers finding a small, recessed button he'd noticed when he first sat down. The emergency manual override for the kitchen's industrial fire system. It was a physical safety, designed to bypass the digital controls in case of a total power failure. He slammed his palm against the button. A sound like a jet engine ignited overhead. The ceiling didn't just leak, it exploded. A massive, high-pressure wall of water and fire-retardant foam erupted from the vents, a torrential downpour that turned the office into a churning white void. The force of the water knocked Marcus backward, his pistol skittering across the floor. Sarah screamed as the cloying scent of lilies was washed away by the sharp, chemical smell of the foam. The roar of the water was deafening, a physical weight that vibrated through the floorboards. David didn't wait. He knew the layout of the ducts and the service crawl spaces by heart. He lunged through the shattered door frame, the water blinding him, but his hands found the edge of the industrial dishwasher unit. He pulled himself along the cold metal, moving by touch and memory. He reached the ballroom doors. He burst through them, a drenched, ghost-like figure covered in white foam. The 15 guests stood in a circle, their faces pale with shock as the alarms began to wail. A high-pitched, rhythmic shriek that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. "Look at the screens," David shouted, his voice cracking but carrying over the alarm. He didn't use the cloud upload. He knew now that was compromised. Instead, he pulled a small, secondary remote from his pocket, the one that controlled the restaurant's high-end AV system for the presentation he was supposed to give. He hadn't just been uploading to the cloud in the office. He had been hardwiring a direct feed from the wine cellar's actual analog backup camera, the one Marcus had forgotten about because it was old, obsolete, and didn't show up on the digital network. The massive projection screens at the end of the ballroom flickered to life. The image wasn't the deepfake. It was the real footage, captured in grainy black and white. It showed Marcus and Sarah, but they weren't talking about a suicide note. They were standing over a laptop, Sarah laughing as she used a specialized scanner to replicate David's thumbprint from a glass he'd used earlier. "It's done," the real Sarah said on the screen, her voice thin but clear. "The Miller name dies tonight. We take the 50 million and David takes the fall, just like his father." The ballroom went deathly silent, despite the sirens. The influential guests, the investors, the city council members, the DA, all stared at the screen. The evidence wasn't a digital file that could be altered. It was a live, raw feed of the betrayal in progress, played back from the analog tape. Marcus and Sarah burst into the ballroom, dripping wet and gasping for air. They stopped dead as they saw their own faces, 20 feet tall, detailing the destruction of the Miller legacy. The heavy front doors of the restaurant suddenly groaned. The industrial chains were cut from the outside with a shower of sparks. A team of police officers, led by a man in a heavy gray coat that smelled of stale coffee, swarmed into the room. Detective Thomas Wilson didn't rush. He slowed his pace, his heavy boots thudding against the carpet. He looked at the screen, then at Marcus, then at Sarah. He let out a long, heavy sigh. "Pop always said." Wilson muttered, his voice a low grunt that David could just hear over the dying sirens. "The biggest rats build the shiniest nests." He reached for his handcuffs, the cold metal clicking with a finality that made David's knees finally give way. David walked out of the restaurant an hour later. The Chicago night was brutal. A freezing wind that cut through his wet clothes and numbed his skin. He stood on the sidewalk, watching as the red and blue lights of the police cars reflected off the glass of the unfinished Miller Tower across the street. He looked down at his shirt. The silver mark on the collar was smeared. The date 22, now just a gray smudge of ink. For the first time in his life, the lack of symmetry didn't make him panic. He had lost his company. He had lost the 50 million. He had lost the woman he thought he loved. The Miller name was once again associated with a catastrophic collapse. But as he breathed in the sharp, icy air, his lungs felt clear. He wasn't an architect of a lie anymore. He was standing on the ruins, but the ground beneath him was solid. He reached into his pocket and found the heavy brass candlestick Jackson had used to attack him. He set it on the curb, a small golden monument to the man who had tried to save him. David Miller turned away from the lights and the noise, walking into the dark, cold heart of the city. He didn't have a plan, and for the first time in 42 years, he didn't need one. He was finally free from the load-bearing weight of perfection.